just have the front slide. Hi, everyone. We started, I started before recording, so we're coming back for just a second. Welcome to Insidious Niceness. We're very excited to be here. Everyone is answering the warm-up chat of, hi, name, pronouns, title, and how do you define being nice? Our main threads and themes of the definitions of nice are things like respect, kindness, thinking of others, being empathetic, having language access, widespread language access, being polite. So y'all are kind of pulling on these threads of niceness. And I think that's one of the most interesting things is when we say the phrase being nice, it rarely has a consistent meaning. We think we kind of get it, but it's actually really difficult. I see other folks, niceness is usually defined as politeness. Yes. And I feel like actually being nice can look like going out of your way to do kind things. So even in this little chat, you're starting to really identify the distinctions of like, what does being nice actually mean? And how does being nice play out in our culture? So I'm really thinking through the culture of our field. So please keep introducing yourselves. Let's talk about the expectations for this space. So I'm going to just give a pause so you can take a quick look. Okay, we're going to go through each one. This is a really, really complex topic. So our first expectation for this space in this conversation is it needs your full attention. If you are in a place where you're trying to multitask right now, I would respectfully request that you just watch the recording later. The reason for that is we're going to be talking about some pretty complex things as they apply to you directly. And it can be easy to misunderstand, misinterpret, or take things really hard if you're not paying attention to the whole conversation. So again, I understand we often need to multitask in other spaces. This just isn't that space. So next one, ask questions and clarify as it comes up. This, again, is a big and complex topic. Now, when you're asking questions or clarifying as gentle reminders, this is not a place for mic drops or proving yourself to be right about something or more righteous than the other participants or me. And the other piece that just isn't going to happen today is there will be no debates or questioning the validity of the really well documented structural and interpersonal violence and oppression carried out by all white women and other folks. But today we're really focusing on the culture cultivated in this field predominantly by white women. I was born a white woman. Turns out not a woman, but still white. And so white woman culture is my culture. That is my cultural heritage. It's my background, and I am well versed in how this functions. And I'm part of the problem too. So that gets us to our next thing. You're going to be uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable, you're probably not engaging with this material in an in-depth way, or you're just kind of you're keeping it at a place where you can sit. But being uncomfortable is actually a sign of learning in contact with new information that's asking us to grow. So today I'm really asking you to grow. And the last little bit is there are no right or wrong answers or single solutions to this topic. White women's culture in the movement is really, really big. It is always okay to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, or I need time to think about that. As a gentle reminder, not every action requires your reaction, and not every reaction requires your action. So hang tight, sit in the discomfort together, and we're going to get to a better place. The last expectation that is not on the slide is If you unmute yourself to share, please help our interpreters and our deaf professionals who are on the call by announcing your name before you start talking. So that's the only other expectation here today. Before we get too far into content, I want to really name learning is deeply uncomfortable. I am going through my own learning process on this topic and on these issues. I got here by listening very deeply and very intentionally to authors, writers, thinkers, culture critics who represent targeted and marginalized identities. As a white person, I've had to do a lot of work to listen to BIPOC thinkers. As, someone born woman, I've had to really listen to my trans siblings in different ways than I have in the past. So I've given you a tailored, brief, and incomplete list of readings and resources that helped me put some of this stuff together and start to formulate my own opinions on this. So this resource list is actually a little bit different than last week's resource list. So there's new books on that list for you that have helped me think about this movement differently. So the last piece of staying with your own growth is you will see these are chess pieces if you're not a chess person. The pawn is the smallest, least powerful of all of the pieces, and that's the piece you see in the mirror. On the flip side, you actually see the queen or the king, but they're looking at themselves and they see a pawn. This is one of the ways insidious niceness functions. We think of ourselves as powerless, or we divest ourselves from the power we have to be able to maintain access to power. So for today, I don't want any stories. I don't want any criticisms of other people using insidious niceness. You will be applying this to your growth alone. If you share a story about somebody else using insidious niceness in the chat, I'm actually going to challenge you and ask, how are you using insidious niceness instead? Because pointing toward others, putting the finger outward, is part of insidious niceness. So today is focused on us as individuals alone. So that's where we're starting from. Please stay with your growth. Now, if we're ready, and I love a thumbs up to be like, Johanna, I'm ready. I agree. Let's make this happen. If we're ready, let's start digging into the content. Oh, I see a lot of thumbs. People who've been here before know the thumbs are my favorite way of being like affirmative consent. Move it forward. Oh, we got a lot. Beautiful. Okay. So let's jump in. What is insidious niceness? Let's start there. So here's a shared definition. Using politeness, agreeableness, and or respectability as cover, while weaponizing interpersonal strategies and systems to gain or maintain access to power, control, and resources. So like you folks were writing about in the chat, there is actual nice, and then there's this second version of it. So when we think about insidious niceness, I hope you see there's an apple rotting from the inside out on the right side of your screen. And that is because insidious niceness is doing internal damage to us at all times. One of the most important symptoms of insidious niceness, and a way to really know it's happening, is when you start to engage in sacrificing others to maintain an illusion of distance from power or from harm, or to maintain the illusion or sense of self as good, nice, a helper. You might be immediately like, what do you mean sacrifice others? I mean, you're in a meeting and you listen to a supervisor sharing something that you don't agree with, but you might have actually helped, right? And then you walk out of the meeting and talk about how your supervisor sucks so bad. You just sacrificed your supervisor, didn't acknowledge your own participation, all in the effort to maintain an illusion of I didn't do that. They did that. There's lots of other examples, but that's what we're talking about. We're choosing to the phrase is throw unders other the butt under the bus, right? We're choosing to sacrifice others rather than owning our part. The important thing to know about insidious niceness is that it is a slow, steady, and gradually building levels of damage to the self and to anyone observing the behaviors. So that's why we have this little rotten apple showing up. You often cannot see from the outside looking in that the damage is increasing. You are hurting yourself and you're hurting people who watch this happen. On the flip side, though, the target of control or exploitation, these folks suffer immediate, extensive, and ongoing harm because it renders them powerless to challenge insidious niceness. How do you challenge your service provider who's telling you, we have a curfew on you to keep you safe? How do you challenge that back as a survivor using services who knows you'll be kicked out of shelter if you don't adhere to that curfew? It's under the guise of niceness, but it strips out their autonomy and decision making. So now that we have this kind of working definition, here's what I want you to hear. These are behaviors, and these are ways of viewing the world. This is not personality traits. This is not who you are. This is what you do. And so many of us do this stuff nearly unconsciously on a regular basis. Now, when we're talking about behaviors and ways of viewing the world, a distinction to make clear is that's not bound to your racial identity or your gender. Anybody, anywhere can use these behaviors and ways of viewing the world to maintain that access to power, control, and resources. And that's actually why transformative conflict is our way to move through this, because behaviors can always change. Our viewpoints can always shift. I know that mine have and still are as I learn more and more about what this looks like in practice and the ways that I use insidious niceness still. All of us are in a process of unlearning. And because you're in a field that has been predominantly structured by white women's leadership, that means insidious niceness is written into our policies and procedures. It's written into how we talk to each other at work. It's everywhere, and we have to know it and name it to address it. So we talked about this tool last week because it was coming up this week. This was sent out with the materials for today. This is actually the abusive power and control wheel of how domestic violence shelters use power and control over survivors. This was built in the late 90s because it's that pervasive, early 2000s? Somewhere around there, because it's so pervasive. So how did we get here? How did being nice become a tool of oppression? The first place we start is in the historical roots of volunteerism and nonprofits in the United States. These were based on colonizing values and white supremacy culture. That's what the WSC stands for. Our entire philanthropy field and nonprofit field work together to maintain access to wealth and privilege. And it was always under the guise of helping unfortunate populations. We can never get away from those roots. We have to reckon with them. So helping unfortunate populations or disadvantaged populations is always about maintaining we are not those people. And that's where we see these roots still coming through. Another strategy of how being nice became a tool of oppression is our fields and our individual refusal to acknowledge the power and privilege differentials in services and program delivery. Things like evidence-based has become standard language in our field. Well, we can't fund that until it's evidence-based. But whose evidence counts? That's where we see those historical roots of white supremacy culture coming through, because who gets to define what evidence is in our field? But we also have things like talking about mainstream programs. What we actually mean when we say mainstream is white women's programs. That's what mainstream actually is. The rest are culturally specific, right? So we need to start thinking more complexly, but we also need to start acknowledging we have power over each other in this field. We have power when we are in positions of leadership over line staff. We have power and privilege over survivors when they come to our services. We have an extraordinary amount of power and privilege. But we as a field have spent an enormous amount of time pointing the finger at men, patriarchy, and never holding that we are carrying it out. We are the foot soldiers of patriarchy. We are the foot soldiers of white supremacy culture in our programs and how we've designed them. So that ties very closely into the replication of power and control tactics that we use over survivors and the power and control tactics we use over colleagues, all under the phrase safety. So when we think about exiting survivors from our programs, and we talked about that quite a bit last week, we are doing it under the guise of staff safety. But who has power and control in that situation? It certainly isn't the survivor. So when we say we have to protect staff safety, when there isn't a real threat of harm, that's power and control and manipulation. But it also shows up when we're working with our colleagues. I have worked for more than one executive director who has said things like, we're all equal here. We all get an equal voice. But when it matters, suddenly the executive director is the one who decides. It goes from being equal to very unequal, which is maintaining superiority over others. Now, you might immediately be like, but I hear your but. I already hear the but. It is one thing to power share while realistically speaking about the limits of that power sharing as a leader. That's appropriate. We want that. What is not appropriate is abdicating yourself from your power that you actually have and insisting it is an equal, flat, or non-hierarchical organization. It's not true, number one. And number two, it's using insidious niceness to make sure you cannot be challenged. So our last big one, and we talked about this quite a bit in our setup last week. So if at any point you're like, I want to know more about that, please go back and watch the Connecting Mission to Movement. But our last big element of how this came to be, for this slide anyway, is racialized and gendered norms set as the universal standards, needs, and expectations. So when we use phrases like, everyone is welcome here, we serve everyone, we care for all women in our community, it's coming back to that idea of the mainstream program. It's not actually true. How many of you, to the point of niceness that someone brought up earlier, how many of you have fluent ASL interpreters on your staff to make sure deaf community participants can access your services? How about Spanish speaking providers? How about we could just keep doing that? It's not serving everyone, but we refuse to name that we are actually only serving a small group of people in our services. And we replicate nice as a tool of oppression. Because how do you fight back when you say, but everyone is welcome here, when it's just not true? So these elements have been woven into our field really deeply. And there's one last big one. It is about the appropriation and depoliticization of community tools. So I want to name this really clearly. Broadly within our field, we have had many, many, many people working in the field steal from and then exclude historically targeted communities. And really specifically, steal the efforts to respond to systemic white supremacy culture facilitation and violence. This is one of those moments where you're like, no, we didn't. We're the women's movement. But we did. And I say we because, again, white lady culture is my cultural heritage and background. I'm part of this. So things like consciousness raising groups in the 70s were stolen from Black women who were using them to name the sexism they faced from men within their community and the racism they were facing within women's empowerment movements. It was stolen, stripped of the racial component, and repackaged as a white lady's tool to help them gain their power back. Things like the safe house networks that became the domestic violence shelter system within the United States was predominantly women of color, Latinx, Black women, Indigenous women, developing safety systems and networks that white women saw, took, stripped of all the political aspects, and repackaged it as services for everyone. Concepts like intersectionality were taken, stripped of their political environment, and then repackaged as a tool for everyone. You're going to start to, this is the whole trend. Stolen, stripped of the politics, repackaged. Tools like self-care actually came out of, within the United States, the Black Power movement. Self-care was originally a community-based label to describe the efforts to care for community because the government wasn't willing to support Black communities, even in the 50s and 60s. Self-care was never about you feeling good. Self-care was about community care in the face of governmental targeting and neglect. And we now talk about it as being mindful while we wash our hands, making sure you stay regulated in a difficult moment, because we stripped out the politics and the community behind it. Things like harm reduction, once again, come out of different communities and looked at the bigger, greater sense of harm, not the immediate, like, I want you to use clean needles if you're using. It was about addressing a society in which we have extremely high homeless populations and folks experiencing homelessness. It was about why and how are drugs being pumped into certain communities, especially through the 80s. Harm reduction was about addressing the political and social environment, not just making it easier for one person to have clean access to clean needles. The Me Too movement came directly out of the founder, Tarana Burke's work within Black women's community to be able to talk about sexual violence. White celebrities pulled on it, and it suddenly became about Hollywood and our celebrity culture. And things like the Black Lives Matter movement. Throughout 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and so many others in that year, I saw so many of your programs putting out statement after statement of how you stand with the Black community. And yet you didn't change your policies, your procedures, or your personal political commitments within the agency itself. Those are examples of the appropriation and depolitization of these kinds of community tools. There is a very long history of white women stealing these tools and repackaging them to be insidiously nice. And if it, again, at any point you're like, this BS, Joanna, this isn't real, you're just be a lefty nut job. Number one, I am a lefty nut job, correct. But number two, these are extremely well documented events. You have been made a fool until you know the real history. That's actually a quote. I'm cribbing a quote. I was made a fool until I learned the real history. If at any point you're like, this is BS, I encourage you to look at the book list I gave you. So I want to pause. Maggie, this would be a recording pause, please. Again, shoot, y'all. Thank you so much for your generous responses. These questions are also a tool for you to help you move through transformative conflict and build your own self-awareness. So these questions, keep using them even after the conversation. So we're going to talk about the structures of insidious niceness in anti-violence work. And again, this is really tied to last week's conversation. It's a little bit more of an overview of how we got to the niceness part, but there's really good stuff in last week's recording. So we start with where this actually begins and the roots of how we got here. And then it starts in carceral thinking and practices within our field, specifically around the concept of justice. Carceral thinking is about emphasizing a sense of justice that is tied to punishment, surveillance, or confinement as ideal resolutions to challenges, harm, or conflict. This definition of justice is built from beliefs that center pain, punishment, constant monitoring, or prolonged suffering as the source of change and growth. It's why we love the idea of, folks who use harm being incarcerated. It's why we love the ideas of things like, self-improvement projects around dieting. Let's just take dieting. It's easy. The way we talk to ourselves, the way we monitor our bodies, the way that we think of ourselves as punishing through exercise, all of that is carceral thinking and practices. It's about sustaining harm to change. It's about exerting control for change. But what we know in the human aspect of change and research is fear is never a long-term motivator for change. You'll get compliance, but you won't get meaningful change. Through particularly white women moving in the field and stealing and appropriating depoliticized tools, it allowed carceral thinking and practices to continue. The next piece that builds off of that directly within our agencies and in our movement is white femininity as a cultural model. We align what's called an emotional culture within our organization to that model. Emotional cultures are about what emotions are allowable to display. So I'll give you an example from when I was a direct service advocate in a domestic violence shelter in another state. We were always allowed to be sad. about something happening with a survivor, when we had another fatality, we could be really, really sad about it. We could even be mad if we focused our anger on the perpetrator, right? Using that language. Things we were never allowed to display was anger toward police, toward the courts. We could talk about that they were broken systems, but we didn't get to be angry. We didn't get to talk about how to dismantle it. We were not allowed to show unrest or dissent. That was the emotional culture. Could always be sad and anger in this very specific avenue. Every organization has a unique emotional culture around the displays of what is desirable, acceptable, or encouraged within the environment. We aligned white professionalism as part of that emotional culture. Whenever someone gets too angry, it's about not being professional. When someone cries about injustice, it's about maintaining professionalism. Those are emotional culture rules and controls built directly off of that. And so we're going upward in our iceberg. We're getting to what things we see regularly. So we've got these structuring pieces, but the next two are what we actually see and can point to really easily. And the first one is conflict misdirection. So I gave the example of not being allowed to be angry with police who were perpetrating violence against our community members. So we couldn't be mad at a primary source of violence. That's conflict misdirection. And what's really common in white women's aligned culture in conflict misdirection is a strong sense of professionalism or blame throwing. Not professionalism, perfectionism. I can't tell you how many folks that I work with that say, "Ooh, I'm a self-identified perfectionist, recovering, but you know." It is deeply tied to carceral thinking. Perfectionism says there is one right way, and you should be punished if you do not do it that way, whether self-punishment or punishment of others. These are so tightly tied together, they cannot be unbound. And then there's blame throwing. This is when we say things like, hey, I know that I'm a member, I'm the leader of this team, right? I'm the program manager. You know, I sat in the directors meeting and I fought for our team that they wouldn't put this policy in place, but they did it anyway. Leadership sucks. I'm a member of the leadership team. I'm a manager. I sat in that meeting, but I just chucked the blame onto somebody else so you wouldn't be mad at me. So you can't hold me accountable because I was a good guy. I fought for us and they told me no. That's blame throwing. Conflict misdirection is about focusing on actors outside of the conflict to recruit supports to adversarial sides. It's also about proving your status as right, as woke, or any other traits that you've deemed important in that interaction. Conflict misdirection is a very intentional strategy to waste time and energy so you can never actually address the source of conflict. And our last piece and what we see most regularly, oh, I see I missed a chat. This hits hard, especially considering the news of Marcellus Williams and realizing he was one of the many BIPOC and white victims of carceral violence. For those of you who do not know, the state of Missouri executed Marcellus Williams, I believe last night, even though there was significant doubts of his guilt and quite a bit of a preponderance of evidence for his innocence. They would not issue a stay of execution. The Supreme Court did not issue a stay of execution. They murdered an innocent man and it was state approved. So that's what Gabrielle is referencing. So carceral violence is very, very real in our world. But the thing that we actually see, and this is where some of my work in occupational identity management comes in. If you know me, you know I couldn't talk for an hour and a half without mentioning it. We see this enmeshment of identity at work. It's not just a thing we do for paid employment, it's about who we are. And so when it becomes about who you are, you can never make a mistake at work. You have to save face. You have to make sure that your mistakes are never discussed or see the light of day, because it would mean that you are bad, not that you did a bad thing. So meshing the identity to the job creates an environment in which you can never, ever do anything other than focus on maintaining a positive reputation rather than being in authentic relationships of meaningful solidarity with others. So we start with carceral thinking and practices as underneath everything. But what we see are our top two sections of this pyramid most readily. So we have to start analyzing. We have to start digging in for us. Where do I see this in myself? Now, I'm going to just be honest. This is the slide I'm most scared to share with you all, but it's an important conversation, so we're doing it. So these are 5 symptoms of insidious niceness in your personal work, not other people. I'm talking to you individually, all 45 of you. So first, a simultaneous process of over-identification with and abdication of power and authority. So we have things like martyrdom and feeling frustrated that survivors don't thank us for our work. I hear all the time, well, this is such thankless work. That's an over-identification with power and authority. You're expecting gratitude for doing your job. And then there's, on the flip side, an abdication of power. So in an opportunity and a moment where you could speak up against something, you actually step back and say, no, I'm powerless in this. I might lose my job over it. Economic security is a very real thing. I'm not trying to trifle with your income in late stage capitalism. But I think of all the times in my career when I could have said something and not lost my job, but told myself I wasn't safe to say anything. That's insidious niceness at work. It is giving you permission to not use your privilege to say something. It is giving you permission to sacrifice others in the room. I can't tell you the number of times that I had white lady tears when a colleague of color told me I fucked up. And they were giving me such kindness by saying, hey, can we talk about, like, this kind of hurt me? And I started crying so hard to be like, I didn't mean it. I sacrificed their needs. I sacrificed their experiences. So I didn't feel bad as a supervisor or a colleague with more privilege in the room than they had. A next symptom that we see quite a bit of is the escalation of language and experience. This is just a super fancy way of saying we take the language of violence, systemic oppression, and abuse, and we apply it to everyday conflict. So what this means is when we weaponize safety or harm. So we're in a staff meeting and something's making us uncomfortable. We don't like how it's being discussed. We feel icky about it. And then we walk out of the meeting and we go to our work bestie. We say, can you believe what oppressive bullshit that was? How could they do this to us? What violence? When it was a disagreement over something small within the agency. That is an escalation of language and experience to create a false sense that there is a good person in the situation and a bad person who deserves punishment, who deserves to be ostracized, who deserves whatever's coming because they aren't on the right side. I'm not safe. I can't tell you the number of times in my coaching sessions with folks where they say the words, I'm not safe. And when I ask them, say more on that. What do you mean safe? I would say 95% of the time, which is a generously low estimate, 95% of the time, what they're saying is, I am uncomfortable and I do not know how to move through conflict. But they escalate the language and experience to say it's about safety, even though you're sitting in a staff meeting, even though it's a conflict with your supervisor. That's a normal thing to happen in that supervisory relationship. So, watching our language and making sure we describe things accurately is vital. Sitting through a staff meeting is likely not actually traumatizing to you. It can be, I want to be really clear, but that is a really small percentage of staff meetings. When we use the language of that is traumatizing, we actually dilute the meaning of traumatizing, and we steal and depoliticize a very important term in our field. Deflection of accountability is our next one. So this is what I was talking about with myself. White lady tears. You're giving me the opportunity to grow, and I start crying and ask, why are you doing this to me? I've done that. I've actually done that. But then there's Darvo. We often use this in working with survivors, and it is deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. I watched this live time in a staff meeting a couple of months ago with an organization not in this state. So, like, y'all don't know them, I guarantee it. Just to be clear, there were only 2 women of color on the entire staff of 26 staff members. We were in a training together. I was leading the training, and an issue of prior harm came up in this conversation. And sure enough, I watched one of the women of color pipe up and say, hey, I'm actually kind of like feeling some kind of way about the harm that happened that was never meaningfully addressed. And one of the white members of leadership immediately teared up and started saying, I feel really attacked right now. All this woman of color said was, I don't like how that went down and I don't think it was repaired. And a white woman leader immediately said, I feel attacked, even though it wasn't spoken to her directly or indirectly. That's how Darvo functions as insidious niceness. And White Women Tears. There's a great book by Ruby Hamad. I think it's the first one on my list, called White Tears, Brown Scars: How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color. Shout out to Kenosha Davenport at SVC for recommending that book to me once upon a time. So the last piece is insincere feedback. We fake it. It's Minnesota nice. It's, oh my gosh, I just love you so much. And then they walk out the door and you turn to everybody else and you're like, can you believe that joke? Or God, I can't stand her. That's insincere feedback. The fourth one is weaponized incompetence. Oftentimes we talk about how men engaged in weaponized incompetence. They do a task really poorly, so their feminine partner picks up the task because, like, Lord, do you not know how to load the dishwasher? It is also when, in a work environment, we use the language of weaponized incompetence and we say things like, I had no idea that was happening to you. Even when we know the rates and stats of violence against BIPOC folks within our movement inside of our agencies. We go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. But we also use weaponized incompetence when we say things like, oh man, I have a great relationship with our supervisor. I don't see her capable of doing that to you. That's weaponized incompetence. We use it regularly. I can't tell you the number of conferences I've been at this year alone where a speaker has said something really troubling and problematic, and I pipe up in the chat or I unmute myself and I just say, hey, I think that's jacked. What are you doing? In a polite, not polite, in a clear and collaborative way. And I will be flooded with messages, message after message after message from white women saying, oh my gosh, thank you so much for saying something. I just didn't know what to say at all. How can there be 300 of us on this training, this conference, and not one of you knew what to say. You can say no. You can say fuck that. You can say I'm uncomfortable. This sounds icky. You can say anything. But we weaponize incompetence by saying, I just didn't know what to say in the moment, even though we see it again and again and again. How are you never prepared? How was I never prepared? It was weaponized incompetence. Now, here's the last one that I'm most scared about, but we're doing it because we got to do this. If you spend the majority of your free time, your media consumption, or your leisure engaged in listening to or watching true crime or any kind of crime procedural, Law and Order SVU, CSI Miami, these are signs of deep allegiance to the carceral systems. My friends refer to those shows as propaganda because they are. It is about making our criminal justice system look better than it is. It's about reveling in the suffering of others. And I get a lot of pushback on this point when I've made it in other spaces of like, no, this is how I spend my time. This is about leisure. Why are you spending your leisure on the suffering of others? Why are you spending your leisure focusing on a false vision of a criminal justice system that doesn't operate that way? That is so much time and energy and commitment to carceral thinking and practices. Because who is safe in our criminal justice system? I guarantee you, as a white woman, you are likely safe if you're a white lady. If you're not a white lady or a fellow white person, you might have different risks involved. But I'm assuring you, Insidious Niceness has a deep relationship to a love of true crime and crime procedurals. So, the last little bit here before we really start getting into skill work is naming very clearly. It's not fragility. It's never been white fragility. Sun Young Shin wrote a very excellent article you now can't access because it's behind a paywall about white flammability. So I don't know. Does anyone know who these three characters are? These are three cultural characters. Does anyone know what they are? Can you throw it in the chat for me? Do you know their names? I'm pretty sure you'll have the one on the right. Who's the one on the? Oh, you have their actual names. No, these are cultural figures. What do we call the lady with the haircut on the right? A Karen. Yes. Does anyone know who the lady in the middle is from the 90s? That's a Becky. And all the way on the left, we actually have the first version that came out of specifically Black communities. She's called a Miss Anne. So Karen, I want to make sure I got her name right. It's Karen Bigsby. Karen Grigsby Bates wrote a really excellent article in NPR. I'm going to copy and paste it right now because I don't think it's on my resource list. But if you ever want it and you really feel like reading it, here you go. Please don't read it now. Oh, that did not work like planned. Okay, we'll send it out afterward. So, what we're talking about here is historically the Miss Anne appeared from the 1817 is its first known usage all the way through the 1880s. The Miss Anne is a woman who upholds the system of violence, trafficking, and slavery while always saying she has no power to change what's happening that her husband is doing. She can't help but uphold it. We get the Becky in the 1990s. This is a woman, a white woman, who consumes a ton of Black culture or other BIPOC culture, but then uses her white privilege to not actually advocate for any kinds of changes. So if you are a person who's like, oh, I love Beyonce, I am down with Beyonce, bae, queen, but you do not support the actual lives of Black people in your community, that's a Becky move. And then last, we have the Karen, and this starts appearing right around the 2010s and on. The Karen is the woman who uses the system to engage in racial violence. All of these are people who insist they love the food, the products, the culture, but will not support individuals or will actively use the resources to do harm if they feel threatened, out of control, or worry that their access to resources will be removed. So, when you think about talking with white folks, they're not fragile, they're flammable, they are combustible, and they will burn everything down around them to protect access to power and resources. We describe it as different forms of niceness, different forms of politeness, agreeableness, but all of it is based in a violent history that white women have been upholding these cultures for a very, very, very long time. So we just went through the really hard structuring parts of like, what are we talking about? I'm giving you a minute. I'm not going to ask for any feedback because like we just hit some hard stuff. If you're feeling like zesty about it and you want to put it in the chat, please do. If you got thoughts, put them in the chat. But I really want to hold, where do you see this in yourself? I see all of these things in myself because it is only through self-awareness that we can address what we are doing. And again, it's not tied to your racial or gender identity. These are tools and ways of looking at the world that many of us had handed to us regardless of our gender and our racial dynamics. If you fit into the white lady category, current or former, you are especially ingrained in this system. It's going to be harder for you to see it. Okay. So, how do we do something different? This shit sucks. I think we can say that. I'm pretty sure we can just like universally name that this sucks. So, how do we move out of niceness, insidious niceness? How do we stop using a weapon of interpersonal and system strategies to maintain or gain access to power, control, and resources over others or in comparison to others? So, this is to pull you on in. I will not be using people's names as we read chats, but here we go. Someone cuts you off in a heinous way in traffic. No accidents, no harm. There's no real foul other than they cut you off in a heinous way. You give them a little like, little to be like, hey, buddy, not cool. They whip you the bird and slam on their horn and they speed away. Fill in the blank of your thought. I hope that. What's a thought you have? And again, these won't be flattering. These are not your best, highest self responses. I am going to share what I think, but what comes up? What do you fill in that blank with when they beep, they flip you off, and they zoom away? I hope that. Their socks get wet. That is such a sweet version. Somebody cuts you off, asshole. I'll say the asshole part. I hope they get pulled over. That's my number one. That's actually a sign of my carceral thing. I'm like, I hope you get popped by the cops. And by popped, I mean like they're going to get you in a speed trap, not you die. Depends on the day. I hope they get pulled over. Some days I hope they don't kill somebody. I hope you get pulled over. Yes, yes. They crash. I hope you get into a crash. I hope you reheat your dinner in the microwave tonight and the outside is really hot and the inside is really cold. Again, Raylene, that is such a, I wasn't going to use names. I'm so sorry. That's a very sweet response. So all of this is a way to see that we get stuck in adversarial conflict. I'm really consistently, I'm like, I hope you get pulled over. I hope your speeding ticket is expensive. That is a sign of adversarial conflict. They caused me the most minor inconvenience possible on the planet. I just didn't like it. And I think you deserve to be punished. That's a sign of carceral thinking. Now, flip side, You just made a pretty epic mistake. You missed a goal or you caused somebody harm. What do you actually say to yourself on the inside? What are the thoughts you have when you made a really big mistake? I am the worst human being alive. I am so freaking stupid. I am terrible. Yeah, I have these thoughts too, just to be very clear. Samesies, buddies. We have those kinds of thoughts because we are also stuck in carceral thinking against ourselves rather than recognizing we made mistakes. We can fix this. Yeah. Oh, someone just said, oh crap, how am I going to fix this? We take such a level of pain, suffering, and confinement, punishment as the way that we fix our own mistakes. We use adversarial conflict, even talking to ourselves, and that does real harm. So there are four main types, not main, most common. Let's go most common types of conflict and resolution. First, we have adversarial. This is the most common one in the United States as a main cultural approach, especially in white cultures. It's you versus me. There's a winner and there's a loser. I want you to hurt like I hurt. I want you to suffer because you made me suffer. There's a winner and a loser. Then we have, this is a quick primer. We can go into depth on another day about each one of these if you want. But then there's restorative justice. Restorative conflict and resolution is actually about seeking to restore the person or situation before the harm happened. Now, again, I'm giving you really Cliff's Notes versions of these things. So if you're deep into that particular type of conflict and resolution, please come chat with me more about it. But we're really doing a quick summary here. So it's about seeking restoration. It can extend to community repair, but it often stays really centrally focused on a victim and perpetrator dynamic, which actually replicates elements of adversarial conflict. There's a clear victim and a clear perpetrator, and the perpetrator has to engage in restoration with the victim in order to fix what happened or to address what happened. Then we have generative conflict. Generative conflict is really when we start to see there's interdependence between the individuals and the systems that are having the conflict, and that there might be conflicting interests, goals, or principles. So the whole shtick of generative conflict and conflict resolution is about effectively managing the conflict of interest, goals, or priorities to get to a greater outcome. Again, all of these have different places in the world. But then there's transformational. And this is, to me, the only one that truly addresses insidious niceness. Transformational conflict and resolution is about addressing the immediate situation while also doing the work to identify the systems that facilitated the structure in which the conflict happened. So when we're talking about transformative conflict, it is fundamentally a radical approach. So last week we talked about what radical means, and what radical actually means is addressing root causes and conditions that facilitated the conflict. Transformative conflict process says we actually can't take the conflict between people out of the system it happened in. And the ecosystem itself needs to change to respond to the conflict. This means it is a focus of relational justice. Relational justice is defined as the practices of equity and justice produced through cooperative behavior, agreement, negotiation, or dialogue among actors in a post-conflict situation. What that means is everybody is responsible in some part for what happened. There is no victim and perpetrator. There are parties in conflict. And what this does for us is it actually requires mutual change within individuals and also systemic accountability to change. So if you have a problem with staff members, you have something escalate between two staff members. Transformative conflict says you cannot ignore how the system of your agency allowed that conflict to occur. What has to change within that system to prevent this from happening again like it has? So I spend a lot of time in coaching sessions helping people move through conflict. But that's only ever one part. And transformative, again, names we are never solely victim or solely perpetrator. All of our actions, interactions, and decisions influence how the conflicts unfold, which means we all have to change to repair. Before we move beyond this, do we have any questions about the 101 super brief primer on what transformative conflict is? Because the rest of this is just naming skills and talking about them, but it's based on transformative conflict. So I want to make sure you're with me. If you got no questions, you know my love of the thumbs up, my friends. Oh my gosh, no, someone just sent me a great direct message. Did I touch on the roots of transformative justice in queer and trans BIPOC communities? No, I did not. That's a great example. I just kind of appropriated and depoliticized a tool. I just insidiously niced on all of you. So thank you, human, for bringing this up. Transformative conflict really does come out of queer, trans, and BIPOC communities, especially because those are very small communities. As a queer person in the queer community, I might have a conflict with somebody, but I have to see them at every event I now go to. There are so few of us. It seems like a lot sometimes, but there's so few of us that we cannot afford to just cut somebody else out and be like, you suck, you don't belong here, get out. This is a very deeply politicized tool that comes out of marginalized communities. Thank you, community member, for bringing that back and calling me in and reminding me that, like, oh, look, even in my presentation, I insidiously niced because it's that prevalent in us. I see, and minorities have to think about their own physical safety and confronting conflict too in ways cis white people do not. Yes. So, okay, let's talk about some skills here because that's really what we're doing. In 2008, oh boy, I feel old in this moment, just like a little bit. In 2008, there was a really excellent YouTube video by a man named Jay Smooth who talks about responding to racist behaviors. And he's a white dude, right? So he's really trying to give skills to other folks on how to talk about racist behavior. So that's where this suggestion actually comes out of. It is about establishing behavior of what you did versus conflict around who you are. So when you move into a moment of conflict, if you see insidious niceness happening in yourself, if you see insidious niceness or other forms of conflict happening in your organization, your focal point has to, I'm literally telling you, it has to be on what they did, what you did, the behavior. Because, and this is Jay Smooth's reasoning that still stands sound and resonates with many current speakers. If you go after who they are, if you run up on them and say, you're a racist, you have now ensured that they do not have to change at all. It's who they are. It's a part of how they function. That's not a thing you can improve. But if you stay on what you did, you have an opportunity to engage in relational justice by saying, hey, what I did was messed up. What I did caused harm. It's back to when I asked you, what do you think about yourself? I'm a terrible person. I'm so freaking stupid. That's identity. You can't change those things, but you can always address what you did. So I want to invite you to respond. Where have you seen examples of confusing behavior with identity in your own mistakes in the field? So you don't got to go too deep and too personal, but I want you to apply this. Where have you confused these two and focused on who you were rather than what you did? This might be a little too dicey to share. Oh, we just had a really great chat in of transformative conflict and justice makes sense to me. And I think it will take so much time and work to get to this point because it requires society to change. A hundy. Yes. So I find myself thinking about what alternatives can move us toward the short term to help, and at the same time, make these efforts to move towards transformative change as a long-term goal. That's a great reflection. Thank you. We do need to engage in big structural level stuff, change, right? This is a really big change. That's why this talk is exclusively and narrowly focused on what you are doing, because we cannot engage in society-wide change if we are not the first folks to show up on our own doorstep and see what we are doing that replicates these behaviors, or we are not our own first line of defense in making sure we move out of adversarial conflict. It does take a really long time. I'm still figuring it out too. But we start with us because that is the only thing we truly can change and truly control. When I was younger, I would rather go quickly on the defense mode rather than being open to learning from my mistakes. Yeah, so many, that happens for so many. Thank you. So, whenever this kind of moment comes up in how you're talking to yourself and how you're talking to others, remember, this is a what you did, not a who you are conversation, because we can never know the deep interior depths of your soul. Maybe you are a really good person, but you still did a shitty thing. And being a good person means you're willing to reckon with and repair when you did a shitty thing. That's actually what defines the good person, not the fact that you made a mistake. It's what you did once you were told you made a mistake or you realized it that really, truly defines who you are. Okay, skill number 2. It's literally just a question. How am I participating in this? Oh, I see a chat in. I'd like to say some of my white savior behaviors were not a reflection of my well-intentioned identity, but I'm conflicted about even saying that because I am justifying the whole purpose of this presentation. Listen, I literally just insidiously niced on people and stole community resources and didn't name where they came from. Yeah, we're all in practice together, my good friend. So I don't think insidiously niced on somebody is an actual verb, but we're going with it. So the skill here is, how am I participating? So usually, because in adversarial conflict, it's a yes or no answer. Did I do that thing or did I not do that thing? And it is very rare in that moment where you're like, did I engage in insidious niceness? That people come back and are like, oh yeah, I definitely did. We rarely come to the answer of yes in a tough moment like that. So your next skill is not to ask, did I or didn't I? Your skill is to start asking yourself and eventually others, how are you participating in this? How are you engaging in insidious niceness? How did I show up to that conflict in a really crappy way? It's not, did I? How did I? Because that level of self, that's a real high level of self-awareness. To be able to sit with the idea that you caused harm, that you hurt somebody, that you made a mistake. It takes real self-awareness to not sink with that ship and be like, I'm awful and there's nothing I can do. That's a, it's all my fault. Or to be like, actually, you did this. How am I participating? So again, we're kind of breezing through the skills because it's a little bit harder to practice these. I'm trying to make space at the end for questions. We're pretty close. So this is a list of questions in your packet, but to really help you build transformative self-awareness skills, the most essential way to do this is to actually focus on values-driven action because every person has values that they hold central and are shaping their decisions day to day. Most of us never have to name what those values are. So here's your question set. A conflict comes up. You made a mistake. You did something crappy to yourself. First question, what do I say I value or is most important here? So what am I telling myself or others matters? What do my actions indicate I actually value or prioritize? So I'll give you some examples to kind of apply this. I have a conflict, right? I have a conflict with one of you. Julia, I just see you on my screen. So we're going to just say I have a conflict with Julia. It happens. And I needed to tell Julia something really sucked. Like, oh man, Julia, that really hurt my feelings. And I say I value honesty and an authentic relationship with Julia. And then we sit down to have a meeting. We just like, we're passing each other in the hall or whatever. And I have an opportunity to be like, Julia, that actually really hurt. Can we talk about that? But instead, I'm like, hey, girl, what's up? How's your morning? Oh my God, I love it. Okay, I'll see you later. And I like run away. What did my actions actually indicate I valued most there? Keeping a falsely harmonious relationship with Julia. Even though I said having an authentic, open relationship with Julia is what matters to me. My actions didn't align with my value. And that happens for everybody. Literally, everybody does this stuff. So, what comes next are what are some possible steps that I could better align my actions to what I say I value? So, if I value Julia and having an open relationship with Julia, maybe an action is to send an email and be like, dude, I behaved in a weird way in the hallway because I actually have something I want to talk to you about. And I was really overly nice, but I want to talk to you so we have a better relationship. Maybe it's getting help, right? Like being like, okay, so what, okay, maybe what's going on for what could I do? Maybe I can talk to Julia's supervisor, not to get them to do something, but to be like, hey, you know Julia a little bit differently than I do in this work environment. What would be the best way to raise an issue with Julia? Because I'm feeling too nervous to go at her directly. Possible steps. What specific actions or inactions on my end require accountability and repair? I avoided an honest conversation with Julia and was like falsely nice to her in the hallway. I actually have to own that I skipped the conflict so we wouldn't have any kind of disagreement because I was too scared and didn't trust her to go through it with me. And Julia did something that prompted that. So I got to hold that part of like, hey, Julia's also a part of this. It's not just what I did. How can I own my part and repair with Julia that I didn't bring this up when it happened and I avoided it in the hallway this morning while also still naming, hey, bud, you hurt my feelings in that other meeting. What values-based changes do I need to make to address my insidious niceness? Values-based changes are actually the most predictive of long-term adoption. That's just fancy research talk for saying you stick with it when it's rooted in your values. If you say you value honesty, but you engage in insidious niceness to maintain a false sense of agreement, your value is going to be what holds you to the change. So use your values driven action to have those conversations. So this is a question that's I designed for you to think later because this is too much information for you to have like real reflective thought time. What do you see as the biggest, the most important one? What do you see as the biggest gaps between your values and your behaviors when it comes to workplace conflicts or challenges? All of us have these gaps. Self-awareness and transformative justice and Conflict is about recognizing them. And what are some additional initial ideas you have to practice new approaches and align your behaviors? This one is my favorite one because it's super easy and you can do it at any time. One of the most important skills of emotional regulation and literacy is actually slowing down the rate of conversation and taking an intentional breath with an exhale that is 1 second longer than your inhale. It is a physiological process that indicates safety to us in our bodies. If I start speeding up the rate of my speech, I'm ASL interpreters, I'm going to go real fast here for a second. If I start speeding up the rate of my speech and I don't wait for any pauses in between and I keep going really, really fast, your nervous system is being jacked up with me. I'm jacking up my own nervous system and I'm jacking up yours. So if I hear that you're saying that you're frustrated and I take 5 seconds, just be like, okay, I hear that you're frustrated. And you do that consistently, it actually allows you to stay in a conflict process significantly longer without your nervous system just freaking out. They might be really amped and you staying slow and steady and being like, hey, I really want to listen. So I'm absorbing what you say. I'm not going to reply right away. It signals safety in a conversation. That's a way to move through insidious niceness, that immediate defensiveness we feel of like, no, 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 protect, protect, protect. It gives us space to not protect. It gives us space to hold. And then this last one, these are literally just phrases and skills to start practicing. They're in your packet, so I'm going to breeze through them. What I've reflected on in my behavior is, so if you got to go when, not if, it's a when you got to go through conflict, when you got to address your insidious niceness moments. Here's some structured sentences that you can practice to get here. What I've reflected on in my behaviors is, see, we're parent, not identity, but what you did. What have you been reflecting on? What I'm noticing in myself. So you're in the conversation and then we're getting a little too amped, right? What I notice is I'm really starting to like get a little like frantic with you. What are you noticing? What I'm curious about from your view is, what are you curious about from my view? One suggestion I have to move us forward is, what suggestions do you have to move forward? And then last, what within our environment would have supported us resolving this sooner or more readily? Because we got to situate it in the ecosystem. And what resources are helping us navigate this conflict? It's not just about the system gaps, it's also about the system supports. Maybe you have a really boss manager who will like help you get through the weird stuff together. Maybe it's a conflict policy, a one-to-one grievance and conflict policy. But what's helping you? I see someone once said the appropriate way to respond to someone correcting you is to say thank you instead of I'm sorry. I found this practice to be transformational in how I approach disagreements and conflicts. It takes the shame and negative feelings away that might otherwise make me want to avoid addressing. Thank you. Just use thank you. So my last slide before we get to kind of a wrap up. I don't care what term you use. I know right now this says like ally versus accomplice versus co-conspirator. I don't care what term you use. The most important thing that you can do with your privilege and your power is to not run from it, to not deny or abdicate, but to truly use it in high risk ways to serve justice and communities who have less power, access, and resources than you. All of us will be in different communities at different times. We may even be in the less power, access, resource group. Co-conspirator is about really radically acknowledging that you don't want to do what's done. Now, what that's going to mean is you will likely not be well liked among your peers in your agency. They won't think you're nice. They won't be like, oh, it's just so polite, so professional. When you start to interrupt insidious niceness, you're going to get a lot of pushback and they will fight tooth and nail. I still fight tooth and nail in myself when I see it and I'm doing it and have to be like, Johnna Gans, we got to talk to ourselves right now. So, one of my favorite quotes in the world that consistently pushes me to do better is this: there is no discovery without risk. And what you risk reveals what you value. Do you value group approval or do you value doing what is right? Do you want to look like a good person by using insidious niceness? Or do you actually want to be a good person by challenging this stuff in yourself first and then in others? Because you don't get to use this stuff and insist you're a good person. That's just looking like one. Those values and those actions do not align, and what you do demonstrates what you actually value. So we're right at 1 o'clock on the money. I can stay an extra 10 minutes for questions, conversations. Y'all know that I really love when people share what they're taking out of this, what they're thinking of. And if you want to get a hold of me, I'm not really on social medias, but I am on LinkedIn and will eventually friend you back. You can also stay in touch. I have like a sign up to be notified of like additional trainings and whatnot. Thank you for being here. Thank you for moving through this conversation with me. I am really honored to be in this work with you all. So if you gotta go, peace out. Thank you. And if you want to stay for questions and additional discussion, I can stay a little bit longer. Maggie, if you gotta go, I can take co-hosting privileges.
I can stay on.
Stacy, yes, you can rewatch this video. It is available for members for up to 30 days after this date to make sure you can rewatch this. We also know that the promotion period was very short. It was like a 3-week turnaround. So you can always rewatch for the next 30 days. How about other folks? Anything you're thinking about? Anything you want to ask? Anything you want to challenge me on? Come on down. Let's talk it through. Okay. Kind of waiting.
Joanna, I have a question. This is Ani.
Hi, Ani.
Hello.
I know Ani.
So this may be an example of me trying to like fix someone else, so permission to call out.
Do it.
But I'm asking like my own behavior when I notice a coworker who is also a white woman feeling feelings and frustration of I was so